All right, so here we are in segment number 2 of our most excellent conversation about lighting the candle, a world that works. We're investigating the group phenomenon of conversation, dialogue, and how that can lead to empowerment, not only to personally, but to communities, and how it can lead to, empowerment for nations of people. And it starts with people talking. It's just people talking. So in our first half hour, we really had a lot of fun, working with two terms, emergent and equanimity, and then having some kind of interesting thoughts about that. We were talking at the end of the last half hour about how impossible it is to prove a negative. And there are people that use that as a ploy or a tactic to keep people off balance. That if you don't like what's in the the community square with regard to conversation, all you have to do is call somebody a name, and then watch them backpedal and prove that they're not that. And I want to say, this is where we probably could talk about things in general without getting into too many specifics. But Vanessa, did you have any other thoughts that you wanted to express that you were left with after that last conversation?
No, I think I'm ready to move on. Thank you.
Yeah, so we live in a time where it's almost inconsequential to call somebody unfairly a name, and there's no recourse and no retribution for it. I mean, the worst thing that happens is that every once in a while, when somebody publishes an article about someone that is completely fabricated, totally made up, no basis for it whatsoever, the world famous quoting, sources who know, those sources who know, they're the ones who are giving up all the dirt. And of course, nobody ever has to be held liable for that, because we live in a society right now. Think about the rules that are set up here. So for some strange reason, Congress passed a law years ago which made it impossible for any elected official to be sued for libel. To prove libel while somebody is in an elected position, which is why many of our elected officials lie with impunity. They make up a story, they say it over and over and over again, it gets repeated everywhere they go. And so what's interesting about that is that there's another group of people who write articles, for thousands of publications worldwide. Some are syndicated and big names, some are networks, and the long and the short of it is they are all very well schooled in the whole idea of you can't prove a negative. There's no proof for it. So the thrownness to call people names and I'm going to use this terminology because it's one of a half a dozen different things that you can immediately derail and change the subject. And I'm listening to some people that are talking about the whole unsolvability of the inner city crime problem. So we've had 50 years of money being spent. The first empowerment legislation was during let's say the Johnson administration, that was supposed to resolve the inequity in education opportunities. It was supposed to help, kids in the inner city live safer lives, community policing. There were all these great things that were going to happen. How are we doing with that? Is there a correlation between declaring war on something, war on drugs, war on poverty, pick a subject, and then creating a bureaucracy to make sure that gets administered properly and there's constantly money available through budgetary processes? Is there any correlation between that and making the world a better place? Does there seem to be a lot of evidence for it at the moment?
My curiosity would be, has the question been asked to those who are committing the crimes, what would you rather be doing? Like, what would have more value to you than, because a lot of times there's probably, there's some learned things, there's some prestige, there's power dynamics, there's all that kind of stuff. So, if you could replace it with something else, what would that be? What would they rather be able to do? Some of them may say, this is the way I want to live my life. And in that case, now you're stuck with like punitive stuff in prison. But I bet there's a pretty high percentage that would rather have an opportunity to do something different than what they're currently doing. What is that? Let's focus on that. I'm sure there have been studies and stuff. I don't actually know. I just think about like Carol Dweck with mindset, and when, they went in and instead of trying to force these kids to stay in school or incentivize them or do study groups, they just taught them to believe in their own ability to have a growth mindset, to be better than they currently are at the things they're learning in school. And that had some pretty interesting shifts. So they focused on their belief, and what they found was a lot of them wanted to believe that that was true. And the only reason they didn't is because no one had bothered to tell them. So I don't know. Again, where's the emergent?
For sure. And I think the really interesting part of that is in a conversation where everyone's sure that they know who's at fault, is there an opening somewhere for people to talk about something new and different? And I recall in several different committees that I was on, including the Blue Ribbon Task Force on Substance Abuse in Wyndham, we studied the problem for about 6 or 8 months. And when we got finished with it, our recommendations were treatment, that it makes no sense to incarcerate people for having a substance abuse problem. And there were people that were so disappointed because they wanted us to come out and, as a, what I call a little blue ribbon task force in Willimantic, Wyndham, Connecticut, tell the whole rest of the world to legalize all of the, illegal drugs and allow people to make their own choices. We're going to treat them under any circumstances anyway. So why not give people the opportunity to make their own choice with regard to recovery and treatment and that sort of thing. And then there were other people who thought that we didn't go far enough in terms of wanting to completely change the judicial system. I don't know if you remember this or not. In the 1990s, they actually created a drug court. This was a very forward-thinking movement that came as a result of a lot of these things that happened. But instead of making people go through a turnstile of being arrested for possession and or commission of some sort of a crime while under the influence, et cetera, where they would almost immediately be put in jail, be forced to go through withdrawal in that circumstance. And then by the time they finally finished doing their time and come back out the other side, they went right back to their behaviors of before they went in. There was actually no difference made by the incarceration. It was not a corrective action. It was just purely a punitive one. And I don't remember in any of those conversations in Roxbury or in Hartford or in Middletown or New Haven, where anyone was asked the question, things aren't working in your neighborhood. If you could, what would you like to have there? They weren't considered possible. And the whole point of what we were trying to do was to allow that to potentially become possible. where they first could even have the questions. And a question like you just came up with all these years later could come out of somebody's mouth. And it might be somebody who dealt with a real failed, teenage set of years and lived past 21 and said, I made it. Now I got to make this possible for other people. So it's a brilliant question. If you had other choices, what would they be?
Yeah, I know. Well, maybe one of the things made me think of it. There's a woman who runs this really cool company, and she basically works with hardened criminals, violent criminals,
Yep.
who teaches them how to be entrepreneurs, because that's what they actually are. They learned how to run a business of a gang or a drug, line, whatever it was. And she just shows them how to take all of these skill sets and inclinations they have and point it towards, making money in a legal and productive way. And they flourish, they thrive. And, and she talks about how terrifying these men are, and half of them end up in tears working with her when someone just, opened a window that they didn't know was there. They looked out, and then all of a sudden it turned into a door, and they were like, yeah, I want to walk through that, but they just didn't know. Before that, it was just a big blank concrete wall. So, yeah, it's cool work.
Always is. Whenever you can create possibility in the face of no possibility, I don't know that there's a better reinforcement for the person who's chosen this as their lifetime endeavor.
Yeah.
It only takes one win every once in a while. The old story about the man walking down the beach with thousands of starfish on it, and he's lobbing them back out into the surf, and somebody comes over and says, "What are you doing? This is undoable. What you're doing makes no difference." And he picks up a starfish and he throws it into the surf. He says, "Made a difference for that one."
Yep. I love this starfish throwing story.
Yeah.
So
it's a great story.
So here we are. Go ahead, Vanessa.
No, I'm just gonna say it's an easily understood metaphor.
Yeah, there's another one that was published, I want to say, in the Parade magazine section of a Sunday newspaper that came out of, the writer, I guess, came from Boston, and she was talking about how she was out on the Cape, beachcombing, walking down the beach, and off in the distance, she could see these two young boys. They were probably about 7 or 8 years old. And as she saw them, with the sun glinting off of the waves and the cool breeze in her face and everything, the idyllic, romantic setting of these two young boys skimming stones across the surf was just more than she could bear. She walked over to them and she said, "Are you boys having fun?" And they said, "Of course we are." "Well, what are you doing?" "We're wasting snails." So my wife and I, in the last 25 years since we read that, anytime we see a couple of boys being boys, we call them snail wasters.
I like that.
And that's what you call a private joke.
That's what you call a private joke.
Now you've let us in on it, so thank you.
You're welcome. So here we are, and it isn't like we didn't have enough problems in the country already. And there are many people who basically see the opening up of everything, the borders and, the shutting down of police departments in the Pacific Northwest and all of these sorts of things as having absolutely no functional direction to them. There's nobody guiding or leading a process, if you will. They're just more or less like, let's be hands off on all this stuff. Let's send out people that are good with conflict resolution, where we've been sending policemen. And, I don't see any of them doing ride-alongs. I don't see any of those folks beyond the theoretical in the things that they're passing, at a local government level that are supposedly going to save money and reduce crime overall, all these sorts of things. They're, in my opinion, and I don't have any other information, so I can make a statement knowing full well that nobody can prove I'm wrong. They're not working. They're not working. The evidence is that there's something missing in the approach. There's something missing, and what's being done is being done for a reason other than making the community stronger, faster, better. And the evidence for that is the number of people in record numbers that are leaving major metropolitan areas where these things are going on. And at the same time, anybody have any relatives or friends down in Texas at the moment?
I got a friend down there, but I haven't heard from them in a while.
Yeah. You don't have to look very far, to really hear what seems to be going on. And I don't watch broadcast news. I don't watch Fox. I don't watch Newsmax. I don't watch CBS. I don't watch CNN. All I know is that if something is that important, for some reason it shows up on my phone as like a news report from one of the outlets. And can you ever picture turning away kids that are 8, 9, 10 years old at the border? Can you ever picture like what human being of sound mind and body in the United States of America would turn a kid away who's come 2,000 miles and is crying? There's a question that needs to be asked there, isn't there?
Yeah, there's, it's also really interesting the things that can lead someone to being okay with that decision, and I remember this experiment they did where it's not very ethical. I don't remember the exact details, but basically it was someone whose job was to push a button and shock someone who was in another room.
Yeah.
And, and they went through these stages of the likelihood of them shocking them. And the more detached they were, like if they could only hear their voice, they shocked them a lot more than if they could actually see them. And, and it was just this, the horrific treatment, was from the same person changed based on their relationship with that person. So is someone afraid they're going to lose their job and they're not going to be able to feed their family, or they've just become numb to the whole process and they feel defeated and they don't think that they're, or they've just abdicated and don't see this as their problem, or they think it's going to be someone else's problem. I don't know. It's again, I think all of these things, you look at that is a result, that is a symptom, so what are the deeper, the hard things that are probably very convoluted and involve people that are no longer even in decision-making power anymore, that are now out of this. So we can go back and trace it back to understand what got you there, but then you can't focus on what got you there. It's what is the thing, so maybe it's, how do we create a feeling of empathy for all people, even if we're in fear of those people. It's like after 9/11, there's an entire, basically, if you were, there's a lot of fear over someone who didn't look like what we thought of as, an American or whatever. So, and that, and it was justified in a way, as a natural response to have this fear. So then what do you do to help with that? And the other thing that just struck me, it's just funny, we accepted in Quester's way that there would always be the possibility, and it was going to happen repeatedly, that a kid was going to pee on the yellow slide. And we could have done everything we wanted to do to try to keep that from happening. But the reality of it was kids are kids and they have accidents. And so we had a spill kit and we were ready to go when it happened. We made it a game. We made the best of it. It wasn't fun. We made sure anyone that was going to work in our park knew at some point you're going to clean pee. And if you have an issue with that, and I remember some, adults saying, what's wrong with these parents that they can't teach their kids not to pee themselves? It's like, are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm.
So there will always be problems, and not all of them will have good solutions. So now it's, who do we choose to be as we navigate those things? And, are we just going to pass judgment on something we don't understand? Or are we going to begin with empathy while also paradoxically holding people firmly accountable when they screw up and it creates problems, So I don't know. It's all very interesting and very complex.
Well, it is, and the other part of it that it seems pretty clear to me is all of that adult thinking that basically says these things are going to happen, and now what we need to do is to prepare for these potential outcomes, and make it happen in such a way that everyone's taken care of. Right thinking, responsible adults can come up with a solution for anything that hasn't happened, and make it something that is not the end of the world. However, when people do things for which they have no responsibility of the consequences, and they just remove the rules from a situation, and they tell all of the people who are those folks that are supposed to keep tabs on a situation so that it doesn't go out of control, you can't do anything about this. When that's the instructions that they have, where do you look for a response, or where do you look for a solution when there doesn't seem to be anyone at home who's really interested in things working? Their idea of working is much different than the status quo.
I remember having a intense argument with my brother, who's a couple of years younger than me. When we were kids, we were probably like 10 and 8, and my mom was trying to mediate. And she finally got so frustrated. She said, you know what? Go ahead and kill each other. She just literally abdicated out of frustration with the fact that there was no reasoning with either of us. We were just in a state. And it was funny because that kind of jarred us out of it. And then, we kind of just walked away from each other and whatever. But how often is it, what? I mean, all I see in the discourse is a lot of arguing over why the other side is wrong, or why this position is wrong, or who's at fault, or how far back you want to go in administrations. And, so maybe that's part of it. I'm not saying that that's the reason. I'm just saying that at some point, sometimes the hands get thrown up, and, and it's like, what, if you guys can't even come to a basic agreement on what the human decent thing is to do, you're on your own. Just figure it out for yourself. Maybe that's part of this.
I completely agree with you. And that's really where what I was talking about earlier, when it comes down to the rhetorical name calling, like the first thing that happens are people coming out and calling each other names. There's no possibility for anything good to come from that. And they're not interested in anything good coming from it. They're just interested in handling it the way they've always handled it until the next thing that didn't work came along. And how will they handle that? Well, pretty much in the same fashion. But in the meantime, we got real human beings. We have real human beings.
Yeah, we do.
These are living, breathing, laughing, crying, feeling wonderful people, They didn't get out of bed, wishing that they could be in a place that made them feel unsafe. And at the same time, we're not necessarily a place where they're going to feel any safer if they're going to come here and be with the same people that they left in the country that they're fleeing from. So is anybody asking the big questions like, okay, so we got this, it ain't working for anybody. What are we going to do about it? Because we are the strongest and the best nation on the face of the planet, so-called, right? Aren't we the best problem solvers that the world's ever seen in our own mind?
Yeah. I guarantee there's people asking the questions, and I'm also willing to bet that not a lot of energy is fed to that by the population of our country. they're feeding the argument, they're feeding the name calling. That's what we're attracted to. It's again, it's simple, it's easy to be angry and to just point out the window rather than, look in the mirror. So, yeah. But there are some amazing, I'm working with some people right now that are doing incredible things. They're bringing such gifts and such value. And the biggest challenge they have is the fact that people would rather, I don't know, chug a can of soda and, yell at each other than, try to better themselves, and it's not that people aren't trying to better themselves. I think that kind of came out wrong. It's just, they don't get the level of attention proportionate to the value that they can potentially create. And these are people who've been at it for 30, 40, 50 years, decades of just investment in understanding how to help humans live their best lives. And it doesn't get fed. It gets fed, a much smaller scale than all of the other stuff that we're talking about gets fed. So questions are being asked, but you need people to raise up and say, yeah, that's you politician that I voted in, pay attention to that question. Why aren't you answering that question? I want to vote for people who do that.
The really interesting part for me, Vanessa, if you want to chime in, by all means.
Yeah. Okay. No, I'm just listening to what you're all saying. So.
And you're free to do that. So the whole issue here, Ken, is it comes down to, in the country that is probably one of the best food producers in the entire world, we still have people starving to death. Mm-hmm. We have, the best teaching possibilities in the entire world. Not for everyone, but they're here, okay? We have the same as far as shelter is concerned. We have the same as far as access, to financial freedom, all of those sorts of things. There is a potentially, it's a chasm of disconnect between people who are coming seeking access to those things and then us providing access to those things once they get here. And part of it is how they're coming and the numbers that they're coming in. And part of it has to do with whether or not we really are interested in making it easy for our own people. I mean, you can take blocks of folks, do a little bit of looking into how things are going for 3.5 million Navajos, that are on the reservation. Mm-hmm. Do a little bit of looking into how their health is, what their percentage of diabetes is, how many of them don't make it to 60 years old, If you want to talk about somebody taking an interest in going in and making a class action difference with a block of human beings, beautiful, wonderful, warm human beings. I know them, I love them, they're relatives, but who can take on that kind of level of things not functioning, or you know what I'm saying? And somebody once said, I can't say if the last name was a Bigay or a Billy or whatever it was, but it was one of the more common Navajo names. If we ever decided to get as organized, as other groups of people, we can have anything we want. We're going to have to set aside our bad habits. Speaking of emergent philosophy and a guppy in a shark tank, I think people left that meeting and went home and said, yeah, but what are you going to do for me now? That almost everyone looks at any of the common cause problems that we have, its solution being at least a generation away. What do we do now?
Plant a shade tree under which you may never sit.
Someone has to be the planter.
Yeah. Oh, and they're happening all the time. I mean, we're, as much as it's kind of interesting, it's and it's good for the listeners to remember we're talking a lot about the challenges right now, but look at what we've done as humans, how amazing. There's a lot of really cool, amazing stuff going on. So yes, there's also, the disconnect and the dynamic, and, we're more aware of it now because we're so much more connected. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the value that's been created, really globally. And, so maybe it's, figuring out how to amplify and leverage what's working, and, and help create more opportunity for where it's not working, for it to start working better. And, rising tide rise all ships types of stuff. So, and I'm not saying it's not out of whack, and, there's a lot of inequity, and, absolutely, but it's not like we're completely screwing everything up. There are things going right. Sometimes it just feels like you're screwing everything up,
Yes, that's another one of those negatives that you can't prove.
Yeah, I just know I'll have 3 more meetings today, all with beautiful, smiling people who've had incredible challenges in their life that they've risen above, and are incredible, graceful contributors who are doing it because they can.
Yes.
And, and some of them that come from various backgrounds and various levels of initial opportunity or privilege or whatever, and they accept that and they recognize that, whatever that means, good or bad, and they're just choosing to be better in service to something bigger,
And I guess, that's one of the definitions of leading a life that matters, and that's to be in service of the greater good. And the whole notion of being in service, I think, is something that could be freshly revisited by a whole generation of people, where we've actually produced a couple of generations, groups of the population. And this would be good for another broadcast, because we're getting towards the end of our time here. But have we taught people to think of themselves first, and their own microcosm of the few friends that they have, where they get their money from, where they live, their own ideas about what the world is and should be? And are these folks at a point now, as they get into the next level of generationness, many of them are into their 40s now, and are starting to see that there are bigger questions, that the world doesn't live and die by a corporation that plants 1,000 new trees a month, that all of those things that are in service of showing that they're conscious about what goes on in the world, and they want to leave this a better place, while on the other side of the whole thing, they're buying components and assemblies from a place in China that is systematically using slavery to put the parts together. It's an unknowable, unsayable question at the moment. It's too big for most people. It will take a community. It will take a culture. And as a very smart man once said, all you need is love. Love is all you need. So I'm good for this session. It's been really great, and we hope that you at home are enjoying it as well. And just keep coming back and listening to what we have to say. Talk to your friends. Get into, good debates about what's possible for all of us human beings if we just happen to throw in together and decide that we're here to make this a world that works because we're lighting a candle. Ken, any final words?
Yeah, if you want to have a good debate, first learn how to have a good debate. Don't make it, because that's a skill. And if you don't know, you're not going to have a debate. You're going to have an argument. So grab a podcast or go online and just Google debating 101, whatever, and learn how to do it. And then share that information before you dig in.
Terrific. That's great. Vanessa, anything else?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point, Ken. I have 2 things. So The first one is just backing up a little bit, just as pretty much said towards the end of this session, but just that, it's when you were talking about just finding our purpose and living for something bigger and realizing, and I just thought of I don't know if it's a quote per se, but just the idea that, when it's only when you lose yourself that you find yourself. So like going along with those lines of, when you lose yourself in service to others, when you lose yourself in service to something bigger than you, when you lose yourself in just, forgetting about your needs for the moment, or I say forgetting about your wants for the moment, and then just, the thinking about what someone else needs and being able to cater to that, is really special. And I think that's one of the things that, that would help to make this a better world for sure. And then and then backing way up to the beginning, Bill, you mentioned, and it was neat how you mentioned it in the last session, and you brought it up again in this session. I just wanted to make sure that the listeners especially get the full scope of what you're saying. So knowable, unsayable, and unknowable and unsayable. Can you just real quickly elaborate on, I think you were saying how we would ask questions?
Yes. And yeah, the whole idea of having a conversation whose intention is to bring forth something new is to acknowledge that heretofore in the group of people, there may or may not be some things that is impossible for anybody to know right now. And the whole goal is to create an emergent thought or philosophy that makes a difference and that allows people to potentially go a completely different direction. And, I think it was Margaret Mead who basically said, don't not believe that, a group of people can make a difference. In fact, they're the only ones that ever have, small group of people. So when you're having a conversation and sharing tit for tat with things that you read on Pinterest and, Facebook and Twitter and what have you, and you're just sharing your facts and, the things that you've decided are how the world is working and what's true. When you get into a conversation that requires some real thinking and some real sweat, it can be very confronting for people, and it might be the best use of their time they've ever spent in their entire life. And that's all I've got on that subject. So anything else, Vanessa?
Nope.
You know what? I think that brings me to a point. The last thing that I am going to put out there is put yourself out. Do more than you have to. Let's see where that gets us.
I agree.
Because this world doesn't demand an awful lot of us on a daily basis, and you and I are the difference makers. That said, have an amazing week lighting your own candle and making the world a better place. Adios.
Right.
See you next week.
Bye-bye, all.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a world that works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can hear us at exvadio.com/podcasts, Apple Podcasts app, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and wherever you find podcasts.